Aloha, hello. Welcome to Sovereignty Speaks. Very happy to have you all here today. I think I know all of you, but I'm Gary Sandiford, the Provost here at Oklahoma State University and a proud member of the unconquered and unconquerable Chickasaw Nation. So it's nice to be here with you today. I'm just here to say hello. Thanks for coming over on still kind of a chilly day, but it's getting nicer than it was the past 2 days. So we're very happy to have you all here. I'm very excited about hearing your guest speaker. And now I want to introduce the director of the center, Elizabeth Payne. Elizabeth.
Welcome, everyone. We're grateful that you did venture our way on this a little bit chilly day. So it is my honor to introduce to you Dr. Kathleen Guzman, Dean Guzman. So I first heard of her from her students, and I am not huge on social media, but their dialogue about excitement at her being appointed as interim dean was hard to miss. They were literally thrilled that someone that they respected so much as a professor was going to have an opportunity to be interim in the highest role at the law school. As a graduate of that program, I will say I'm similarly inspired and encouraged. Her vision, her leadership is the type that will really, truly continue to put the law school on the map and to create opportunity for so many advocates that we need to have go through that program so they can represent their nations, our nation, and others. So you will have a handout at your place that talks about her achievements and her professional pedigree. She's, well, hard to say much more than somebody graduating with highest honors from their bachelor's, their law degree, being the head of the law review at the University of Arkansas, and then going on to Yale. She has a lot that she's achieved, and I think we received the benefit of all of that experience. So I hope you will enjoy me in welcoming her today, Dr. Guzman.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Provost Sandifer and EP. Someone gave me a little hint, told me that's what I should say. And to the Center for Sovereign Nations. I'm just really, really honored to be here and be able to talk about something and share some of my past research with you all. And it's research that honestly just kind of, well, I would say it would blow my mind. It blows my own mind. But that suggests that I think it's great research. I don't know that it is, but I say it because it makes me so enthusiastic and so excited and so passionate about that which I'm able to share with my students at the University of Oklahoma College of Law. I had a fairly uneventful trip up here, although I was stopped on your campus by the campus police. I think that's when I tried to make a U-turn because I got a little bit confused as to where the union was. But they were so nice, and the gentleman said, here, let me take you along where you need to go. And I think, he said, if you're hyperventilating like this when you speak, that's not a good thing. So follow me. So thank you. If you hear about someone who was wreaking havoc on campus, it was probably me, because I also went down a one-way street. All right, so 49 years ago. It was 49 years ago, and I was 5 years old. And I was standing with my grandmother in a store in Macon, Georgia, and I was staring at dog collars. And I wanted them desperately. So why? My grandmother, she had changed her name from what her name was to Jacqueline. We were not allowed to call her anything but that. Mind you, there's no French as far as I know in my family, but my grandmother had decided she was Jacqueline. And she had a little dog, and that little dog was named Gigi. Surprise. And Gigi used to travel around town with my grandmother in her purse. And Gigi always had little French blue toenails, and Gigi always had rhinestone collars on of every single color. And I wanted those collars. But more importantly, I wanted to be Gigi, because I thought she really, truly did have the dog's life. So I did what any self-regarding, maybe selfish 5-year-old might do. When I was looking at those dog collars, I grabbed a fistful. And when my grandmother wasn't looking, I stuck them all in her purse. She had no idea. And so it's time to check out. My grandmother places things on the counter, and the cashier said to her, what about the things in your purse? My grandmother, what things in my purse? And the cashier said, the things in your purse. What things are you talking about? Over comes the manager. And the manager said, please empty your purse out, ma'am. So she did, and she dumped it over, and of course, here come all the dog collars with rhinestones and gems, and it looked to me like things that, I wanted to wear, and I didn't only want to wear one dog collar and be Gigi the dog, but I wanted to stack them. I had visions of stacking those dog collars, and they were beautiful, beautiful. And my grandmother looked at them, and then she looked at me, and this is one of those instances where you're not quite sure if you're remembering it directly, or if you're remembering someone having told you what happened. But I think I remember it directly, and I shrugged, and I said, just charge it against my inheritance. All right, I don't really know exactly where that came from, for a couple of reasons. First off, it wasn't as though we had a lot of money. We didn't, all right? So we didn't talk about that kind of thing. I don't remember talking about money. We didn't have much money. We didn't talk about much money. We did watch, or at least my grandmother watched a lot of soap operas. So it could have been for something like The Guiding Light, thinking about inheritances, I'm not sure. But then again, in a way, we did talk, or she did act with regard to inheritance quite often. And the way that she did was in this way. She would take a roll of masking tape, and she would put your name on that masking tape, and she would put it under things. And you knew where you stood with my grandmother because you could flip things over like the jewelry box. And if there's a piece of masking tape underneath there, and if it said on there my name, I knew I was in like Flynn. If, by contrast, I heard this sound after I had done something a bit sassy, whoosh, I knew that masking tape had just been taken off of the bottom of fill in the blank. Gigi the dog, the jewelry box. I knew that was what was going on, and I think at some deep level, I started to either conflate in an inappropriate but perhaps an understandable way this idea of inheritance and love and regard and respect and relationship between my family members and me. And it never ended, in a sense, because here I am, here I am, however many years, 49. I had to look at my math, 49 years later. And I'm still thinking about that episode. I still think about that episode. I still think about that issue. I still think about inheritance. And I still think about the ways that it can translate into a deeper conversation about relationship between people and things, and about relationship within systems as well, and about relationship with regard to culture and with regard to property. And it's been my passion. And so, as I say, when I talk about my research blowing my own mind, it's again, not because I think it's super powerful, but instead it's super powerful to me because it's allowed me to have some insight, I think, into a lot of different aspects of our society and into a lot of the maleficence, one might say, or the mischief of some of our nation's history with respect to property and our relationship therewith. All right, so fast forward about 23 years. It's 1993, and I was sitting in my office in Norman, and I had gotten married on the preceding Saturday, and my husband and I had moved across country from Philly, which is where I was living at the time, and we'd arrived in Norman on Thursday, and I was to begin teaching the following Monday. And I was only going to be teaching here for a year. It was a one-year visitorship, and I was excited, but I was also incredibly nervous. And I had no idea where I was going to begin. And I was sitting there thinking, how in the world am I even going to begin teaching my classes? How am I going to teach property? How am I going to teach wills and trusts? And then a gentleman stopped by my office, and he said, I've been thinking about giving up a course that I teach. And I was wondering if you might be interested in teaching that this year. I'd very much be interested. What is the course that you've been teaching? And he said, it's Indian land titles. And I said, wow, that's really fascinating. I haven't really thought about that very carefully until perhaps this point in time. Can you share with me the book that you use? And he said, well, I don't use a book. I said, well, how do you teach the course? And he said, it's all up here. He said, all of my information is here. His name was Renard Strickland. You might know about Renard Strickland. He's a genius and a brilliant man, and he is so knowledgeable with so many books that he has written. not simply that he was using. And that kind of grabbed my interest, and it grabbed my interest for a couple of different reasons. Not because it was something shiny like the dog collars, but because I had at least begun to recognize, as I said, this integration between property and culture, and this recognition that so often we can use property or transfers thereof as ways, as entry points for understanding relationships on a small sense, but then on a broader sense, we can use property, including the many forms of its transfer, as a window into the soul of a community, as a window into the culture of that particular community. And I said, tell me more. Tell me more. He told me much more, and I started to research much more. I began to notice acutely what might have been very long appreciated by others, and perhaps it has been well appreciated and is well appreciated by people in this room. But it was this notion, and I hope that you can still hear me, and hopefully that will still work, but it was this notion of exactly how we define property. And I can't get over teaching, so I'm sorry that it's kind of babyish and pedestrian to have a marker and to have this, but this is makes me so excited. But what is property? I used to think that property was the item. I used to think it was the thing. I used to think it was the stuff. I used to think it was the land. I used to think it was the dog collar. I used to think it was the item. And I realized that property isn't the item at all. That's a very perhaps medieval or earlier perception of property as reification, as in the item. But instead, property isn't the item. Property is the legal relationship between people or cultures and that item. So property itself is very metaphysical rather than the physical. So it's that legal relationship, and when I think about what the legal relationship means, or what that term even means, I recognize then, all right, well then property is simply, it wasn't just me recognizing it, maybe it was just me having my own personal aha moment that many others, many philosophers and jurists and jurisprudence had fought for long. But I recognize that property is that relationship, so it equals rights. It's a legal relationship, therefore, it's all about rights in things, not things themselves. It's about that which we can do with X rather than X. And so again, I was thinking about it. What are those rights? What are the sticks in the bundle, if you will? Because it can be such an annoyingly repetitive metaphor as to almost be disregarded. Property is a bundle of sticks. And in those sticks, in here, rights to do things, rights to use, rights to possess, rights to consume, possibly, rights to enjoy, rights to exclude others from, and then rights to transfer. And I recognized, wow, if this is so, if property equals a relationship between and among people vis-a-vis these rights, who has what rights relative to whom and when, and that's what all of our property questions basically ask us, then maybe I thought I need to be more careful and more attuned, and maybe I need to hear that which Renata Strickland is talking about, for have a context within which things like use, possess, transfer, consume, destroy, even arise. And maybe then I recognize that property is far more contextual than I ever realized that it was. That it can shift in shape and form because, again, it's not the item, but the rights in the item. And it's the relationship, and relationships are fluid and they're dynamic. And sometimes they're good, and sometimes they're bad, and sometimes they're stable, and sometimes they're unpredictable, and sometimes they're strong, and sometimes they're weak. And so property is all of those things. It made it so much more dynamic for me to think about property in this way than to think about property like this. Oh, this is a marker, and it's, quote, my property. Instead, this is a marker, and I have rights in it. Might not be forever. The rights might just last for a short bit of time, but I have rights to use it, and I have rights currently to possess it and consume it. Well, hopefully not, maybe make the ink run out, and I have rights to enjoy it, I have rights to exclude others from it, and I have maybe some rights to transfer it. And that's what property is, that series of rights. Again, dynamic, flexible, changing, and very much driven by the interstitial, cultural, and legal context within which it arises. So, and then I realized, well, everyone says possession is 9/10 of the law. And I thought, well, heck no. Possession is 1/6 of property. Anyway, that's probably the extent of my math that I'm really capable of doing.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
Where would you put the right to conserve or preserve
Well, I
the
think
property under enjoyment or?
I think it would be a combination of use and consumption, because there's a negative as well as a positive. So when we think about, for example, the right to free speech, I recognize that the flip side of that is the right to choose not to speak. And so like the right to preserve, the right to protect, might be a way that we could find captured within use or non-use, in a sense. Consumption or preservation, stewardship, protection, conservation, or enjoyment, because there are different ways that enjoyment takes place. And I think that that's a fascinating question and a really acute one, because I think oftentimes, depending upon the culture within which you're talking about things like property rights, those components, I don't want to call them the shadow components, but maybe for this, I will. Those components aren't necessarily the ones that are brought forth as starkly, or as often, or as commonly, and instead we think of oftentimes exercising rights as a proactive thing, rather than oftentimes as a choice not to exercise certain elements of control and so forth. Because this seems to suggest to me a whole lot about dominion and control. And I think we all know that property is much more than dominion and control. Property includes, as you suggested, conservation, protection, choices against using, choices against transferring, choices to allow others in and not to exclude, if that's what we so choose. And so when I considered this, I started again, and again, this is my first year of teaching at the law school, but I started again to think about things from a couple of different perspectives. So I thought about the feudal notion of property. So feudalism, medieval period, William the Conqueror, and all that kind of good stuff. And I recognized, wow, these rights were fairly limited and constrained and cramped and constricted at that point in time. And property within, let's say, 11th century England, right post-Norman conquest, felt an awful lot like a shackle. And it felt an awful lot like that which mediates between overlords, shall we say, and then people who are on the ground, who maybe are using that property in a way, and who have sublimated their own freedom for, in return, maybe some protection from someone above. And it felt very hierarchical, if I think about property in feudal England. And I think about feudal England because so many of our current property laws stem from, for good or for ill, stem from feudal England, because oftentimes the colonists replicated that which they knew. All right, so I thought about feudal conceptions of property, and it felt, as I said, very vertical, with the crown at the top, and then top down, and then from the top of the feudal pyramid down, very much like, well, you can live here, you can work here maybe, you can do some limited form of use, but you kind of render services back up to the crown. And so what did you have to do? Maybe you had to fight for the overlord. Maybe you had to pray for the overlord. Maybe you had to provide food for the overlord. Maybe you had to provide, well, those were probably three pretty common things, services that you had to do. But property felt scarce. And therefore, I think that created that kind of structure vis-a-vis property. Now, in the colonial period and thereafter, I think it's well captured by a quote that's generally attributed to Gertrude Stein. And she apparently said something very similar to, in America, there's more land where nobody is than there is where anybody is. And that's part of what makes America what it is. All right, we can quarrel with that, right? We can talk about what does it mean to have nobody there? And what does that mean with respect to differences in terms of light use versus possession versus dominion versus control versus structures in a way that maybe the colonists felt created some stability, but didn't recognize was not the only way to have a particular land ethic or relationship with the land upon which the colonists were moving. The colonists also, I think, rather than necessarily be just completely replicating that with which they were familiar, were reacting against it as well. And so you had much more egalitarianism, so to speak. Again, it's all relative by contrast to something else. But a little bit more egalitarianism because there wasn't that same notion of accidents of birth or death driving who had what rights. And there weren't the same components of gender where the eldest male descendant might end up having the rights, or we had things, fancy, mysterious land interests, like those called the fee tail. If you're a Downton Abbey fan, you know what that's all about. But it kind of flattened out the notion of ownership and property, in a sense, because then it was more about, well, again, at least in terms of the way the colonists might have wanted to express it, and the way they perceived it vis-a-vis that against which they were reacting. It's a little bit more egalitarian, a little bit more about equality, and not about eldest male descendants taking title to the property. And the supply and the demand changed as well. It was less, or perceived as, less of a scarce resource. And when you have that, that can also change the structure of what the interrelationships between and among people with respect to things might even look like. Started thinking about Renard Strickland, started reading anything I could get my hands on. Kirk Kickingbird and Karen Duchesneau, 100 Million Acres, that was one of the first books that really captured my attention. Anything that Renard Strickland wrote, I was reading. I was reading books that I found fascinating, but others might have been concerned about which to hear. Semple on Indian land titles. Joe Rarick charts, these thick books where I was reading treaties and treaties and treaties and cases, and I was reading about things that brought me great sadness, because not to be reductionist and not to intend any reductionism whatsoever, because with obviously over more than 550 federal recognized nations and tribes, and some that aren't federally recognized, you can't have, I think, a single land ethic or a single property ethic that captures all of that. But I started coming across things like this. The earth is my mother. With her plow, you are ripping her bosom. And I thought, wow, all right, so when we talk about property as a relationship, and if we can take as a metaphor something like real property, which had been viewed as either maybe a shackle, if we're in feudal England, or an instrument of capital, an instrument to be speculated upon and subdued and dominated, if you're thinking about Blackstonian conceptions of property and manifest destiny and so forth, here's a very different perception. Here's a very different expression where the race, or reese, or ray, my dear friend Professor Tayuagi Helton would tell me I'm corrupting that word every time I say it, but where that is being analogized in literal way to relationship, to a different type of relationship, to a relationship that brings in the item, the object, rather than simply the people who might be competing over resources there too. I walk on the dust of thousands of ancestors who have gone before me. So I read that and I started thinking, this is again a very different view of land, I think, than as a unit of capital to be traded and bartered and sold and speculated on and flipped, in a sense. Very, very different. How about this? We do not inherit the land from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. And so that, again, flipped my mind, because I thought, I had been thinking about things like inheritance as the transfer of property or one means of transferring property, where it came from above, my grandma, and then it came down, quote, below, grandchild. And instead, when I thought, oh my gosh, we could view this relationship as borrowing that which future generations are going to need and have. And then all of a sudden we get back to the notion of conservation and stewardship and care and collectivity in a way that I hadn't before admittedly appreciated. And my research just wouldn't stop. It felt like an inflection point. It felt like, I felt like a child. And I was. How old was I at that point? I don't know, maybe 27. But I felt like a child because I thought, how could I have lived my whole life not recognizing that there could be so many different views of property and rights and relationship? And I was so arrogant to think that that which I had known in its very small way, dog collars and Gigi the dog, was so culturally informed and mediated that I didn't even realize it. I can't remember the gentleman who talked about this, but and I apologize for that. I should know better. But fish don't realize they're in water because that's just their environment. And it's not until you can get a fish out on the dock, perhaps, flopping around. That's how I felt. Like I was flopping around, gasping for air, thinking, oh my gosh, there's a whole nother world out there. And I hadn't ever thought about it before. And I started writing. I started researching. I started writing as much as I could about this. I took transfer, and I really wanted to focus on transfer. And I zoomed in on transfer, and I started thinking as much as I could about how and when transfers between and among people vis-a-vis things could be reflected. And I recognized that basically, you've got transfers during life, and you have transfers at death from a temporal perspective. Not trying to suggest there's just a binary between those two, but maybe it's a way to frame things. So you have your lifetime transfers, gifts, deeds. You have your death time transfers. Oftentimes people say that that's really all that a will is. A death time gift, a dead giveaway. But I thought it's got to be more than that. I started thinking about wills very carefully. Exercises of rights to transfer property at death. And when I started thinking about it that way, I recognized a couple of different things. First off, a will is powerful. As I shared with EP before, it's hard to say that, Dr. Payne, but as I shared with EP before, if a will gives you insight into the soul and mind of its maker, then maybe property systems, similarly on a larger scale, give us insight into the soul and the minds of the system makers. And that's where friction can occur, obviously, because not everyone is going to have the same soul and mind, and not every community is going to have the same thing as well. So I thought about the will. I thought about the will as also a very poignant act, because in a sense, it's a power act, because it's exercising dominion and control over things and then trying to extend that control beyond death. So you're like, it's like putting your thumbprint on the piece of pizza when you got 3 siblings and everyone's scrambling for the last one. It's like trying to control things. But it's poignant as well because it's a statement where we try to imagine the world without ourselves in it. So it's kind of a love letter, depending upon how it's written, to the future as well, and trying to imagine how people we leave behind might be using or might be enjoying, hopefully, or conserving that property that we leave behind. Let me be a little bit more specific from the cultural perspective, however. With death time transfers, and again, I apologize if you can't see it, and I apologize if this is way too, annoyingly, boringly technical. But with death time transfers, you can either make a will or an estate plan, or you don't. And so how might will making translate within particular cultures and societies and particular family groups or nations or different citizens or different peoples, depending upon their perspective, vis-a-vis that property? Go back to the early 1900s in the allotment period, where there was a profound shift of land, or the notion of rights in land, from a collective sense, maybe your traditional reservation, to an individualized sense, where we took large land masses, the government, took land masses and broke them up and allotted parcels out to individuals. Thomas Jefferson, he was kind of the master of this. He was enthralled with the rectangular survey system and we can see the traces of that when we fly from, Oklahoma City to Dallas. And you look out the window and you see all those straight lines. So he marked a grid upon the land. And then with reservations, so many of them were broken up with allotment, where instead of having this different sense of collectivity and connectivity, and communitarianism and collectivism, vis-a-vis ownership. Vis-a-vis ownership. It was like, rather than 100 people all having collective use and possibly consumption and possession and so forth of that 100 acres or that 100 million acres. Now you have 100 people, each having that over 1 acre or something along those lines. And it's a vast difference to kind of foist a very private property conception, which includes all kinds of notions of dominion control, including death-time transfers of wealth. And it generated all kinds of negative consequences. Massive land loss when reservations and when tribal communities and individuals and citizens and nations ended up then having an individual interest in a certain number of parcels and an individual relationship with those parcels rather than a more collective one. Well, there are many results. There's so many stories that could be told just about this. But when I thought about it, when I researched it, when I read about it, I thought, gosh, many have said that was a carnival of exploitation, that allotment was, that this translation of collective ownership to individual ownership, exploitation, carnival thereof, because then that opened land to all kinds of settlement and all kinds of practices, and possibly loss, because definitely loss, because the government turned the collective into the individual, into the atomized, into a disaggregated, rather than an aggregate resource, on a wing and a prayer, become a Christian yeoman, become a productive Christian yeoman. Well, maybe that works if that's your goal. Or maybe it works if there's training and so forth, or there's an understanding about what that might do. And I don't think that there was. This is what my research has revealed, and again, it's probably something that you all already know. But one of the devastating consequences of forcing individual property ownership upon individual people, particularly where there had not been this strongly inculcated sense of, this is mine and I'm going to leave it to you later, was that there weren't many wills being written. I think it was Chief Joseph who said something along the lines of, transfer the land. He might have said sell the land. He said, why not sell the sky or the sea? Very different conception. And so with individual ownership, coupled with wills not being made, we ended up with fractionation. Again, something with which you might all be very familiar. But if I owned, for example, a parcel of property that looked like that, and let's just say there was 100 acres, and if I didn't do an estate plan, and if I died without a will, in other words, if I died in testate rather than testate, then the state was getting to decide where my property went and where my interests went thereafter. So if I died leaving 5 heirs, those who would take, if I failed to write a will, maybe they'd each have 1/5 of an ownership interest in this land. And then if each of them died without writing a will, then you have 25 people possibly, each of whom have 1/25 of an interest in the land. And then if they all died without writing a will, then you have 125 people, each having a 125th ownership interest in the land. Then you can see how that kind of atomization and disaggregation, again, could result in a little bit of additional dividing and conquering. Because that's kind of, to me, what it felt like, and what it continues to feel like today. I talked with Mike Jones. This was many years ago. He, at the time, was with the BIA, the Land Realty of Anadarko. No, he was in D.C. He came to visit, and we spoke at great length about some of the difficulties with fractionation. He shared with me that there are some parcels, some allotments, post breaking up the reservation property, some allotments, individual title foisted on people often, not always, depending upon the treaty, depending upon the individual, but where the lowest common denominator for ownership on that parcel is a Google. And I said, I don't know what a Google is. And this is before Google, like, oh, I'm just going to Google my name and see who hates me now. But apparently 100 digits is a Google at the lowest common denominator of ownership on some of these original allotments was a Google. And then he shared with me, sometimes federal government says it costs more for us to track and then cut checks on ownership interests vis-a-vis those properties than individuals are getting. Young man brought me a check, I think it was the following year, and I started researching about this, and that was maybe 1994, so it was some time ago, and the check was for 7 cents. And he said, this is a check that my grandfather got. It's a check my grandfather got for his ownership interest in this property. Now, you could see how there would be a desire to reconsolidate because that could generate power, that could generate, that could cut down on transaction costs, that could cut down on that could open up opportunities and open up collectives again. And so the federal government stepped in a couple of times and said, yeah, we've got a small interest, we're just going to escheat it. Am I good on time? 10 minutes? We're just going to escheat that property interest to the tribe. You had a couple of attempts out of Congress to deal with that. Something called the Indian Land Consolidation Act. That was the late 80s. Originally in the late 80s. Revised later, because it went to Congress. Supreme Court struck it down. Hodel v. Irving, I think, said that's unconstitutional. That's a taking of private property without just compensation. Congress, go back, see if you can figure it out. Congress did a little bit more tinkering with. And back to your point again, because I think your point is so emblematic of all of this, or revelatory of all of it, perhaps. But Congress said, oh, this is what we'll do. We'll see if you have a little interest. We'll see if it's an interest that didn't generate much return on that interest in maybe I can't remember how it was worded then, 5 years preceding the decedent's death. Then we're going to escheat that. This is such a feudal concept. No, we escheat to the, quote, overlord back in feudal England. And we're going to say we're going to escheat, that the property's going to escheat to the tribe. Okay? But one of the things that upset me about that was that was such a cramped view, again, of what value means. Because if we define value, and we say it's a low value interest because it only generates X number of dollars in any given year, I think, well, then if I owned a Rembrandt, is that a low value interest? Because what's that generating every year for me in terms of an income? Maybe nothing. Maybe the relationship that I have with that art is different and need not generate value in traditional senses or non-traditional, in pecuniary senses. You know, and if I think back again to things like we don't inherit the land from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children, then there's a whole different conception to value. I walk on the dust of thousands of ancestors who have gone before. Different conception of value to land, to real estate, much more relational. You know, much more relational past, present, future, and future, present, past. In a way that I don't think, you know, oftentimes Anglo conceptions of property have been willing to often articulate. And as are well expressed in the whole notion of, oh, you have it, then you die, you pass it on where you want it to go thereafter. Collect it, protect it, give it away after your death. And there are different ways to view the property. So, Indian Land Consolidation Act, struck down twice by the Supreme Court of the United States. American Indian Probate Reform Act, APRA, comes in thereafter. We have APRA. We have APRA today. And what APRA does is, I think, something very similar. And I think it takes us back to feudal England. And it re-imports certain things like life estates, like primogeniture, like whoever dies last ends up with the whole. Things that the colonists pretty much rejected. Many tribal nations and many citizens have rejected APRA because I say, that's not the way that we want to have this relationship with our property in terms of its transfer at death. And that is what most recently here has brought me into that which I'm doing now. I'm a little bit of a hiatus because I'm learning a lot about interim dean, and I don't have time to do all the work that I had really been wanting to do. I know it's a hard stop, but two things real quickly. Estate planning. I'm working with the Oklahoma Indian Legal Services in Oklahoma City. And we have clinics where we're helping with estate planning and trying to meet people where they are vis-a-vis their property and their interest, and have that type of conversation so that individuals who might not want to be subject to the top-down APRA rules, American Indian Probate Reform Act rules, can estate plan and can get out from underneath that forced system, forced regime that was like ex cathedra, I think they call it. I'm certain I messed that up too. Working on that. It's been a wonderful clinic. It's in somewhat nascent stages, but we now have one full semester under our belt. There have been caravans, all kinds of opportunities. Second, I've been working on a model tribal probate code. Sounds like a lot of arrogance, doesn't it? I agree. How can you have one model tribal probate code when there are so many different tribes with so many different views vis-a-vis the land? I recognize, but having partners within tribal communities. I've read every tribal probate code I can get my hands on to try to build something from the ground up and give options and give ideas, and then get feedback and buy-in or not, rather than something that the federal government or the state of Oklahoma gives us in terms of, well, you don't write a will, you're stuck with the state code for where your property goes at death, rather than something that's very culturally, organically grown from those and by those who are most affected by that particular provision. I love what I do. I do. I love what I do. Ms. Vile knows. Love what I do. I appreciate y'all giving me some time. I could talk so much more. Osage Native. There's a movie. There's a movie coming out. There's a book. There's a history. Killers of the Flower Moon. I love what I do. I'm happy to talk more about it with anyone